unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Philip Howard, who is the founder and leader of an organization called Common Good, also affiliated with Columbia University, and the author of numerous books. Most recent book is one called Everyday Freedom, Designing the Framework for a Flourishing Society, which I think is kind of a, it's pretty dense, but it summarizes a lot of what you've been doing over the last 3 decades, beginning with the book Death of Common Sense, which I think has got to be still in print. I mean, that book's been around for a while, but was followed up by a couple other books, The Collapse of Common Good, The Rule of Nobody, one called Not Accountable, which I have kicking around here somewhere, but also Try Common Sense, Replacing the Failed Ideologies of Right and Left. This one, The Lost Art of Drawing the Line, How Fairness Went Too Far, and Life Without Lawyers. Of course, you and I are both lawyers, so we have to be too careful about this life without lawyers idea. So welcome, Philip.
Nice to be with you, Greg.
Now, look, your work covers a lot of different ground. And I guess, one way to characterize it, if I were to look at it through the lens of my work and my research area, is you've got this balance that you need in every organization and every society between what we might call rules and what we might call discretion, right? That's sort of the dichotomy that we talk about in organizational economics. And if you get that balance wrong, then, bad things can happen. In management theory, we've, in recent years, really dug into this idea. On the one hand, we want to eliminate bias through the use of data science, through the use of algorithmic decision-making, and so forth. But if you go too far in that direction, then you hollow out what we might think of as practical wisdom and judgment, and we leave people in a state of futility and powerlessness and impotence, and ultimately wind up with distrust and a lack of meaning. And I think you've diagnosed that in the larger and broader society. And one concept that you've introduced, which I really like, is this notion of the law as like an operating system, right, for society. And we've seen this subtle change over the last couple of decades. And I don't think it was sort of an overnight development, but sort of a step-by-step incremental development whereby our society has begun to rely much more on what we might think of as, algorithmic law, or what you call correctness. And it's had good motivations, certainly. Was inspired by a desire for more freedom, more fairness, and so forth, but it's really kind of gotten out of control. And one question I would have for you is, we've had all of these political leaders who have come into office talking about deregulation and so forth. They seem to have identified the malaise or the problem which you've identified, but it seems like there's this relentless march which nobody can really, stop. I mean, is it sort of an inevitable consequence of modernity and the division of labor? I mean, I think Weber would say that bureaucratization is the natural endpoint of sort of modern society. I mean, is there any way to push back against that, or is this sort of a utopian or quixotic project that you're engaged in?
Well, first, let me say, I have a degree in law, but I was trained as an economist. And my first jobs were doing economics research in post-nuclear war recovery, as it happens, at the Oak Ridge National Lab. So I come at this as a microeconomist, not just as a lawyer. I actually think political leaders have completely misdiagnosed the problem. That while there is a growth of annoying big brother law and it's easy to kind of say we need to deregulate. The flaw in most of this law is not its policy goals, in my view, or even its assertion of the role of government oversight, say for a clean environment and such. The flaw is not to acknowledge that law can only work if it's activated by human judgment. That law is never self-executing. If you make it self-executing, you turn it into a bad combination of central planning, 1,000-page rule books, and people spending all day filling out forms that nobody reads and all that kind of stuff, and gamesmanship. So you end up having people game the law in every area of society. Bad employees gaming the law to keep their jobs, unions gaming the law to get power over whoever's trying to run the school or whatever. So we have this metaphorically, this kind of gridlock in society with people and horns honking and yelling and screaming and stuff. This is my right, that's my right. Meanwhile, no one has the authority to make a decision, and there are no red lights and green lights, because we no longer acknowledge that law only works if the people in charge of law can actually make the judgments needed to make the application of law consistent with its goals. And today, law has become, in many areas, counterproductive. I mean, it doesn't make people feel more free, it makes them feel less free, right? And the point of law is to provide a framework to enhance everyone's freedom. So we're not worried that the water we drink is polluted, that we feel comfortable that we have free speech and we can say what we think without getting into trouble. Well, that's not true anymore. We all go to training sessions teaching us exactly never to say what we think and never to be spontaneous. There might as well be a red light blinking in the office that says, "Don't be yourself." So it's I think the problems of government have been largely misdiagnosed by the people arguing over it.
I mean, look, in all of your work, you highlight the importance of practical wisdom and judgment, right? And you point out that most decisions are made using some kind of implicit criteria, right? Sort of tacit knowledge. But isn't it a sign of progress that we can kind of surface the underlying criteria that we use and examine them explicitly? I mean, the entire judgment and decision-making literature is all about observing how people make bad decisions, right? And they allow all of these irrelevant criteria to filter into their decision-making, right? When we look at hiring, for instance, you hire the people you like, you hire the people that look like you, right? If you're a judge, you're going to put a harsher penalty on somebody who is in your out group and so forth. I mean, what's wrong with converting those into explicit rules that constrain one's ability to exercise judgment if it means bias and prejudice and poor decision making?
Right. Well, that's a very good question, and you've correctly identified the reasons why we find ourselves in this traffic jam, because we don't want to be biased anymore or such. But law can only go so far. So we can be diligent to seek diversity, but if you have a DEI person at every decision on who gets promoted, that's like, it's not putting a thumb on the scale, it's putting a massive weight on the scale. You might as well not apply if you're not DEI. And the reason for that is you can never articulate why you think someone has better judgment. You cannot articulate why you think someone is a good writer and someone else is not a good writer. You can judge it if you're a person in charge, but you can't articulate it. most of the important judgments in life are not susceptible to algorithms and such. They, most of the academy, leaving aside the sciences, most of the academy is all about learning and judgment and how we've been trained and just take writing. Both you and I write. Is the writing clear? Is it sensible? Does it make it, well, you and I can read something, and we may or may not agree on a piece of writing, that, whether it speaks to us, but you can't prove it in a legal proceeding. You can't argue it using rational knowledge. I mean, judgment is something that's formed in our unconscious from all kinds of things, by the way, including biases, including, you don't know where the biases are, they're there. I mean, Danny Kahneman, who recently died, the Nobel Prize winning psychologist, wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. It's about all the errors in human decision making. We overweight low risk. We overrate low probabilities. We don't go in the ocean because there might be sharks there. Or whatever. There are all kinds of things, all sorts of biases that humans have in decision making, which made him think that we needed, therefore, many more controls on how people make judgments. So he and I had an argument. We were very friendly, but we had an argument. I said, well, everything you say strikes me as right. But I think the problem today is not that we're letting people make lots of bad judgments. I think the problem in modern society is we're not letting people make any judgments. And that you have to give back to principals of schools and teachers within the schools and managers of the workplace or whatever, the authority to act on their judgment, because it's impossible to have an institution where there's mutual trust if there's not a consistent application of values and standards and all that kind of stuff, all of which requires judgment by the person in charge. And you can never prove that it's not biased. You can second guess it. You can look at patterns and practices. There are things you can look at to safeguard against what you're talking about, but you can't ever guarantee it. And you can't ever prove it. And if you take it away, you end up with what we have in America, which is a lot of really lousy schools, where not one student in 37 schools in Chicago last year was proficient in reading or math. Not one student in 37 schools. I mean, that's an astonishingly perfect record of failure. All because the people in charge can't make any decisions.
Well, I mean, you highlight how important it is to have, rules in all sorts of domains of life. I mean, you talk about checklists, right? So, if you're a pilot, it makes a whole lot of sense for you to have a checklist that would, guide you. And presumably there are other domains, right, where it makes sense to have some procedures, right, in place that are relatively systematic. I mean, it seems like the problem that you're articulating is that we don't have good kind of meta judgment about, where it's applicable and where it's not applicable.
Yeah, let me push back a little at this. It's very important to have checklists to protect against a small error that causes a catastrophic mistake, like forgetting to push a button on an airplane, and then the flaps are locked and the plane crashes and 200 people die. So that's the check. But the checklist is not helping the pilot fly. So when Sully Sullenberger had both his engines go out after taking off from LaGuardia, his co-pilot was going through a checklist to try to see if there's something they could do or whatever and stuff. But Sullenberger wasn't. He was watching the airspeed and keeping the nose down so that the airspeed was high enough so that they didn't stall and crash and everybody die. And he was trying to figure out where to go while keeping the airspeed up. It wasn't a checklist. He was relying on decades of judgment and his own description of how he ditched the plane and what he was thinking and feeling. It's practically a portrait of human unconscious knowledge of these books written by Mike Rose at UCLA, about the mind at work. It's about the knowing is in our action. We're not thinking it through. We know how to fly the plane. He was the plane. He wasn't a pilot in a plane. He was the plane. And it's that kind of intelligence that's required to make anything work. And so the rational mind and the procedures, I'm all for procedures. Let's have procedures to make sure we're not missing something. Let's have second guesses on this and that. Let's inform our judgments. That's all great. But ultimately, it's a judgment. The procedures don't prove anything. And what we've gotten wrong in modern society is thinking the procedure can replace judgment. That's why environmental review goes on for a decade or longer. We never approve a power line because somebody will object and somebody raises one more issue. Let's overturn some more pebbles and see if there's more to argue about here. So I only have one idea, and I've been able to parlay it into 7 books so far. and the one idea is that nothing good happens unless a human makes it happen. And you can't systematize anything to work except the most mechanical type things. You can systematize an assembly line, even that only to a point. So, I think that the change we need in our society is a realization that this massive legal gridlock we've created over the last 50 years has no close, to mix a metaphor. And so we have to, and if you reinstill a human element to things, where you can have plenty of checks and balances, it doesn't mean people can do whatever they want. You can have it be subject to somebody else's decision, whatever. I had this argument with Randy Weingarten, who's head of the big teachers union. I said, well, let's just have a parent-teacher committee on each school and give them the power to veto a principal's decisions to terminate a teacher. The principal doesn't have to have absolute authority. Let it be vetoed. I don't care. But let it be a matter of judgment. Everybody knows who the good teachers and the bad teachers are. Let that judgment be made. Today, basically, there's no accountability. There's no judgment.
But this judgment, judgment is a skill. You're not born with judgment. I think one of your points is that, we're squeezing out judgment. Sullenberger is part of a dying breed, right? As we completely automate the flight controls, the kind of skills that he developed over decades, people aren't going to develop those. I think part of your point is that kind of rules and judgment are substitutes for one another. We talk in the business literature all the time about how extrinsic motivation sort of squeezes out intrinsic motivation. And if you have sort of a Taylorist workforce, then, if you were to remove right, the rigid controls, then people would kind of flounder. They wouldn't know what to do. Should we be thinking about these spillover effects, about how we're kind of hollowing out the judgment, the practical wisdom that people have?
Well, sure. We ought to be doing that, and we ought to be reintroduce rigor into schools and judgment so that people actually don't think they're going to get an A just for showing up, which is what's happened in many elite universities now. And we ought to get rid of the idea that either doing well in school or indeed keeping a job is like fine china, that it's, oh, what a cataclysm, somebody lost their job. Well, I don't know about you, lost jobs before. It's understandable in my case, but it's not. I mean, people are different, and like-minded people need to be, free to be together. I've always thought America was not so much a country that stood for diversity as it stood for a diversity of conformities. So you have the Swedes in Minnesota, the Hasidic Jews in Williamsburg and Brooklyn, the Mormons in Utah, the intellectuals on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, the snobs on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, the Bohemians in Greenwich Village, I mean, it's all these different people, and we have to be careful that we don't let it be identity-based discrimination. So, we can have protections against that. But people have different interests and different ways of going. And one of the great things about America is that it rewarded this kind of human instinct towards making things work differently and better. And if every time, I'm talking from Long Island, and we're on the flight pattern sometimes to planes from JFK, and they'll come over at 2,000 feet, these giant things, right, gliding without that much noise. If the Wright brothers, who really just took flight just over a century ago, were here, they wouldn't believe it. They wouldn't believe that these bicycle mechanics who put stuff together by experimenting by aerodynamics, by putting foils on their bicycle and riding around town and seeing how the air flowed depending on how they put the foil. That's what they did. They beat the biggest physicists in the world. So we've iterated, a group of humans, year after year after year, have iterated for 110 years and gotten us to the point where we have incredibly safe vehicles that have pulled hundreds of people, right? That go. That's not because somebody followed rules, because people kept making things better. People in little shops and in different companies, they sit there, let's do this, and they had pressure, they had wars, they had other things, and they created new inventions, jet engines, and it's just human ingenuity is astonishing if you let it go. And by the way, that's what keeps a society together. So why are we facing this kind of neo-civil war right now between the populists and others? It's because people feel like they no longer have agency. They're being talked down to. They're being told how to do everything. You can tell people what to do, but don't tell them how to do it. Tocqueville talked about this. It's especially dangerous to enslave men in the minor details of life. Basically it drives people crazy. Don't tell me how to do it. Tell me I've got to dig a hole. I'll dig the hole. Instead, we got 1,000-page rule books, and teachers have all these guys to tell them how to do it. Well, if everyone's an idiot, then the schools will fail, going to your point. But no society will work where you treat people as widgets. And that's kind of what we're doing.
Well, I mean, you talk about these different communities, but I mean, don't you have to have sort of shared norms of reasonableness in order to trust the discretion of, say, judges? I mean, if I remember in law school, we would learn about those cases where it was, the man on the Clapham omnibus, right? Like that's what you do. You say, well, what would the reasonable man think? And so, a lot of people would say, oh, that reasonable man, I'm not on the Clapham omnibus. I'm on the L. And, maybe my what I think is different. I mean, at some level, don't you need some shared norms in order for the system to be legitimate?
Well, there's a lot of learning on that says that homogeneous cultures are more trusting and more efficient than diverse cultures. Robert Putnam, a lot of people have said that. It's just, it's common sense, right? Because everybody is bound by the same kind of norms. So that's the reason, Utah is an incredibly efficient state. Everybody's bound by the same norms, right? They have this overriding kind of cultural personality that comes out of a common religion. In New York City, the different areas that I mentioned are not bound by religion. They're bound. Their norms are more, norms of common interest, and such, and common education. But ultimately, in a society, judges and the people who elected politicians, but let's talk about judges now. Judges do have to assert norms of outer boundaries of right and wrong, whether people agree with them or not. Because if you don't have norms, the worst is not having the assertion of norms. So in my construction, law supports freedom, not by telling people what to do. That's not freedom, that's central planning. Law supports freedom by being a framework of outer boundaries of what's prohibited. You can't pollute, you can't discriminate, you can't cheat, you can't run the red light. There are all these rules that are outer boundaries. And within those boundaries, there is a field of freedom. Those boundaries define a field of freedom where people are supposed to be able to not get along. And for me to say, yeah, I think you're an asshole, I don't want to get along with you, fine. There are a lot of people who are jerks, and, I don't want to deal with them. So that's what freedom's supposed to be. And those boundaries have to be defined. One of my problems with American civil law today is that there are no coherent boundaries. If there's an accident on a sledding hill, let's say it's a tragic accident and the child is paralyzed or something, there's no judge who will say, after looking at the facts and the allegations, this was a reasonable risk that we in society can tolerate or not. This just lets you go to the jury, and the jury has no power to set boundaries. The jury's just that case, thumbs up, thumbs down. Nor is the judge setting boundaries on what they can sue for. How much would you take to lose a loved one? $100,000? $1 million? $1 billion? I wouldn't take anything, right? There's no amount of money can make up for it. But that doesn't mean that law should tolerate, well, in one crazy case, the guy suing his dry cleaners for $54 million because they lost a pair of pants. That case went to trial. It could have been dismissed in 5 minutes. If you let justice let people bring anything, then the idea of boundaries is absurd, because you're now subject to the whim of a jury where you could lose $54 million, because some jury goes crazy. Juries are generally sensible, but the problem is juries are not law. Juries should be fact-finding, who ran the red light or whatever. They shouldn't be setting norms. They don't have the authority to do that. So judges have to make those decisions whether you agree with it or not. And today they're not. And the result of this kind of laissez-faire attitude toward lawsuits is that people no longer feel free to interact honestly with each other. No business in America will give job references in the land of the First Amendment. This is crazy. Crazy. Because they're scared somebody will sue. Well, those lawsuits ought to be dismissed, and there ought to be a coherent doctrine of assumption of risk, and blah, blah, blah. All these things that the common law used to have, we no longer have. I did a podcast recently with the head of the American Law Institute discussing, in part, this issue. Judges have abdicated. I'm very friendly with the law lords in England because they have a much stronger sense of the role of judges in setting the norms that are the outer boundaries so that people are free to take reasonable risk. Is a seesaw a reasonable risk or not? I don't know. I'm not a child sex expert. All I know is if you allow a lawsuit because a child fell off a seesaw or did what my brothers did, they would get me up to the top and then get off, right? You know, just the amusement of it. I learned something very important, which is...
Wait, you didn't sue your brothers? Come on.
I learned never to trust my brothers. The very important life lesson, if you let somebody sue, it doesn't matter what happens in that case. All the seesaws will get ripped out. And that's basically what's happened. Try to find a jungle gym. I mean, you know, there are no monkey bars, that kind of thing.
Well, look, I mean, you make the provocative claim that we have, too much law. And I know that this is meant to be provocative because, as an economist, I always like to think that there can be too much or too little of anything. But it's very difficult to come up with some kind of metric, right, for how much law do we have? I mean, what does it mean? I mean, it seems like de Tocqueville pointed this out. He said America is defined by, the amount of litigation that we have. Everybody was suing everybody back in the 1840s. I mean, we had lawyers were the aristocrats of America, right?
I would put the question in a different phrase. I think we have both too much and too little law. We have too much law that micromanages how we do things. I am all for a safe workplace, but a safe workplace requires judgment of regulators looking at unsafe conditions, not complying with 4,000-page rule books and having material safety data sheets that tell you what to do if you happen to drink Joy dishwashing liquid. Nobody is going to drink Joy dishwashing liquid. They're not going to confuse it for milk. So you don't need this crazy regulatory system with warnings against things that will never be real. Warnings against common sand. I mean, literally, go to a factory and see what they have material safety data sheets on. You can't find the thing that's really hazardous amid all the pages. So it's completely counterproductive. It's like all the warning labels on the products, right? It's like a version of The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Nobody reads any of them because there's a warning for everything. So by trying to take human judgment out of regulation, we've created a system of micro-regulation that fails for the same reason as central planning fails. So I don't consider myself a, quote, conservative. I don't consider myself a deregulator. I want government oversight of safe workplaces. But it's not effective to do it the way we're doing it. It's more effective to actually have principles of safety and maybe some rules, maybe like a seatbelt rule or a hard hat rule. There's room for some rules, but not a rule that says stairwells shall be lit by natural or artificial light. That's helpful. I mean, how else can they be lit? So then you have somebody at the workplace going through a form, doing a checklist, all these self-evident things. It's like crazy, right? It's like bureaucracy. It's like a version of the derivative scandal in 2008, except it's the bureaucracy scandal where you have bureaucrats doing compliance and then bureaucrats doing oversight of the compliers and who's reading the forms. It's just completely out of control. So we have too much law in that law shouldn't generally tell us how to do things. It should tell us what to do and give us principles. Australia, a couple of decades ago, had the bright idea of getting rid of their thick rule book on nursing homes, which they had terrible nursing homes, the way America does, and replacing them with 31 general principles. Have a home-like setting, respect the dignity of the residents, that sort of thing. Scholars scoffed, these nursing home operators will get away with murder. Went in a year later, nursing homes were twice as good. Why? Because the people went to work, the nurses' aides and others, not focusing on complying with this 1,000-page rule book, but looking at what the residents needed and wanted. They actually, they became human institutions again. The regulator didn't lose his authority. The regulator had more authority because the regulator could use his judgment. This is a lousy place. No one's happy, whatever. So, but it was focused on the issue at hand because so that's an example of how you move from too much law, micromanagement law, to a system that works. We have too little law in that we have this mutant version of individual rights that allows anybody to complain about anything they don't like without any coherent legal boundaries, so that people don't know where they stand. And instead of making, say, race relations better, they make it worse because people are interacting and the minority knows that the person isn't saying what they think. And they assume it's because of racism. There are studies of this, that the more you kind of make people self-conscious, the more the problem gets worse. So we need to have a clearer sense of what the boundaries of our freedom is, and that requires the enforcement of norms that judges and others are not doing. So we have both too little law and we have too much law, and ultimately my goal, I think the role of law is to, is to enhance freedom, everyone's freedom, the freedom from abuse, the freedom from dirty water, but also the freedom to be ourselves, and to do what humans are good at doing. And you were talking about culture earlier, about building a culture at the business school at Berkeley. The sign of any good organization, the prerequisite for any good school is its culture. And the culture, you can't have a good culture unless people feel they have agency, they can be themselves, they're not, withdrawn or fearful. And you're never going to have that unless you have someone in charge who enforces standards and norms, because that's how everybody trusts everyone else, because they believe that everybody's going to be treated the same way on the same standard. So culture is incredibly human, and it requires an authority, and that authority has to look at its job at enhancing people's freedom, not dictating what to do all day long. Mm-hmm. So, I view these things not as matters of policy, but as matters of microeconomic truths. This is how people are. This is how stuff gets done. The airplanes didn't get evolved because of one generation was smarter than the next generation. They evolved because they did versions of what the Wright brothers did. They tinkered. They had other ideas. They tinkered. They tried. They had trial and error. They adapted. And it's human.
Look, I like this analogy between central planning and this complex statutory law. And as an economist, I'm a big believer in the price system. And, Hayek pointed out the similarities between the price system and common law jurisprudence. But I think where the analogy breaks down is that, central planning in the Soviet Union, this was imposed top down, but the kind of complex central planning that you're talking about, this is coming out of a democracy. People are demanding this, right? It's the political process is producing what people want. People seem to want bright line rules, right? In the common law, you do something and you find out later, oops, I guess that was not acceptable. People want to know ahead of time, right? Okay, what exactly is the cutoff point for the amount of solvent that I'm allowed to have in this chemical?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, Hume talked about this, right? There's a mighty, I forget what he said, but humans are
We're
mightily
addicted to rules, I
to
think he said,
rules.
right?
Yeah, mightily addicted to rules. I once had a reform that I was working on with Al Gore and the Reinventing Government people that was going to substantially introduce flexibility in regulation of certain effluents and chemicals and such against the standard of improving the environment. But it didn't work unless the officials at EPA had, they ultimately had to be able to use their judgment about whether this would work or not. So it wasn't a bright line rule. It was much more of a negotiation and a discussion. And I got the Republicans and the Democrats all on board and such. And Al Gore is going to really simplify this regulatory regime. And then the Business Roundtable, the big business trade group, killed it. Because they said, no, we want to know exactly what we have to do. We want clear rules. We don't want any uncertainty or discussion and stuff. So it got killed. Maybe a month later, I was at some lunch at the White House, and with Al Gore presiding, and I was seated next to some guy, I didn't know him. I said, what do you do? And he said, well, I'm the CEO of DuPont, said this guy. So I said, oh, that's interesting. What would you think of changing this regulatory system to one where you had to have a discussion, but it'd be a negotiation, and the regulator would have more authority and such? He said, that would save us hundreds of millions of dollars a year. It would be so good, I would do anything to have that, because most of the compliance we do doesn't help the environment. I can prove it. And we could do better things for the environment for a lot less money, but just complying with these rigid rules is idiotic. Everybody in my company knows it. He said, why don't we do that? And I said, well, it just got killed by the group that you're on the executive committee of, the Business Roundtable. So there is this instinct people want clear rules, but look where it's gotten us. You can't fix a bad school. We spend 30% of the healthcare dollar on administration. That's over $1 trillion. That's over $1 million per doctor for making them for reimbursement bureaucracy and compulsive privacy regulations that have these draconian penalties if you mistakenly let somebody's name get out or something. I mean, pick a number. Half of that, probably 2/3 of it, could be redirected toward actually patient care or some other public good, strong Defense Department, if we were willing to simplify the reimbursement and willing to accept some measure of human judgment, and frailty along the way. And society would be much better off. But, that's one of many examples of things that don't work in our society because of this instinct, this Tayloristic instinct. You mentioned it. We think that we can Taylorize the whole society. Well, we can't. We've tried to do it. It doesn't work.
Well, it does seem that the problems you've identified, I mean, these are not partisan divides. I mean, we just saw the Supreme Court sort of overturn the Chevron Doctrine, right? I mean, the very conservative, originalist justices, they want to force Congress to articulate things rather than to delegate to the regulators, right, some degree of discretion. I mean, is there? I mean, I think it's articulated in different ways, but it seems like both conservatives and liberals are doubtful of the capacity of individuals to exercise discretion.
Yeah, so Chevron, I think, is specifically about rule-making by agencies underneath federal statutes that that extend the scope of the statute. And the court held, and I think it's generally right, that you shouldn't give deference to that just because it might fit within the statute, because they're making new laws. But when you're talking about you're talking about judgments about a safe workplace or the pollution profile of a particular, chemical company or something. You're not talking about an executive agency making laws. You're talking about the implementation of laws. That's an executive function. And if those people don't have authority, so one of the reasons we have so much rulemaking is because we don't give people the authority to use their common sense. We don't give officials the authority. We're trying to codify everything in a rule. So Chevron, in my world, is not all that relevant if you had a world in which people could actually make executive judgments on the spot. They could still be challenged as being unreasonable but the standard of review is one of, does this transgress the outer boundaries of the reasonable discretion, of an executive official? The judge can review that. But if it's within those boundaries, then it ought to be, that's what law is, right? Police do this all day long, et cetera. And so I think that both parties have the wrong narrative. I'm trying really hard to start a new narrative. Again, I have this podcast with the head of the American Law Institute. I'm doing a bunch of things at universities around the country. Happy to come to Berkeley. I come to San Francisco all the time. But we need a narrative on what would make government, not what to get rid of government. How can we make government work better? How can we fix bad schools or replace bad schools? That's the narrative that's missing. Instead, we just have, get rid of government, give us more government and such. And there are a lot of smart observers. I mean, Joe Klein, the former columnist for Time Magazine, I've done some stuff together in the last year or two. Joe, correctly identifies the pathologies of both parties. The right just wants to, gets votes by saying we'll get rid of it, which never happens, right? We get rid of government, the Tea Party, whatever. And the left says all we need is more money, and they never address what's broken.
Well, look, I mean, you said that this. The problems that you articulate, they really kind of got going in the 1960s, and they were tied up with suspicion of authority, right? I mean, how does authority play into this? Because if you are going to allow people to exercise judgment, that means they're exercising some form of authority, and so therefore they have to have that authority needs some legitimacy. So, right. I mean, was the kind of thing that jump-started this a suspicion of authority, a disenchantment with authority? I mean, a breakdown in the common consensus around who has authority?
No, it was abuses of authority. I mean, authority can be abused, and in the 60s, we woke up to, let's count them. The abuses of racism, institutionalized segregation, the abuses of corporate America with pollution. There were no environmental laws, and so they were just pouring chemicals into the rivers. The gender discrimination, misogyny, not letting women do things. It was right there. You couldn't get the job. You were a woman, right? Justice O'Connor couldn't get a job. Graduated number one at Stanford Law School. Couldn't get a job at a law firm. I mean, it's unbelievable. Right? Mistreatment of disabled children, in sort of mental institutions. Unsafe cars and corporate cover-up for the unsafe cars that Ralph Nader exposed. Lies about Vietnam. And then the kind of sort of the maraschino cherry at the top of this kind of this heap of abuse was Watergate. So here we had proof positive that authority can be abused everywhere, right? And so, and we had built a really happy white middle class society by abusing in part or ignoring lots of things, the environment, people of different skin color, women. It's just we look back on it, it's shocking that we took all that for granted. So we needed to change our values. And it was understandable that the geniuses of the time said, let's just make sure there never be any more abuses in the future. And that's when we got the idea that law would not only tell us what to do, but tell us exactly how to do it. There would be no such thing as an unsafe workplace if we had 4,000 rules on worker safety. We got this sort of sue for anything idea. The idea of individual rights being, if you feel unhappy or you've been treated, you have the right to go to court and complain about it. Well, that was a way of stopping abuse of authority. But what they didn't think about is, well, who are those rights against again? It's rights against whoever's in charge. So all of a sudden, the person in charge of the school or the workplace no longer had the authority to actually make the judgments needed to have a good school. And so the reason we came up with these new legal protocols was understandable because we needed to change our values. It just doesn't happen to work. And the irony is, in the name of greater freedom, we've created a society with dramatically less freedom. People can't say what they think. They can't say, I'm sorry after telling a bad joke. We waste a third of the healthcare dollar in unnecessary red tape. We can't fix a bad school, blah, blah, blah. We can't approve a transmission line needed to move power from the wind farms to the cities. We can't save the environment. We can't do anything. We're in gridlock. And so because anybody can complain about anything. And so freedom does not exist except within a framework of the authority of law. And the authority of law requires human judgment by the people in charge of law, judges and officials and others. What's a safe workplace, et cetera, whether a seesaw is a reasonable risk, whatever it is, they have to make those judgments so that people have a sense of where they stand. And then you get freedom back and people can act again. You no longer have gridlock. But right now we have law not as a kind of outer fence of a corral of freedom. We have law interceding in daily choices. There's almost nothing you can say in the workplace that doesn't have legal implications. Well, is that a free society? I don't think so.
Look, I mean, Alexander Hamilton said that if we were all angels, we would not need checks and balances, right? And so if we were to do this all over again, right? If we were to try to figure out how to address those abuses of power that we identified in the 60s and 70s, I mean, presumably it would not be by converting all of those powerful people into angels, right? But it would require a different type of checks and balances, right? How would we, if you were to go back and have a do-over, how would you How would you do it over?
Well, you do it area by area, but most areas of health and safety regulation would be a set of principles like the Australian nursing homes I talked about, and you would give authority to officials, presumptive authority to interpret those principles in context, and the courts would be available in case somebody thought that they had exceeded their authority. That's one thing you would do. You would have, in the case of the environment, you can't have a, quote, reasonable amount of pollution. So I think you do need presumptive effluent guidelines, but there ought to be flexibility in the system for an official to waive the guidelines if it were better for the environment. I actually did do a reform like that with Gore and Clinton. It was called Project XL. So you need a kind of exceptions basis. You wouldn't write detailed codes like building codes in America, especially in California. It costs $750,000 to build a average unit of housing of a full, quote, affordable housing in California. That is crazy. It's a crazy amount. Why does it cost so much? I've been looking into this. Because there's an accretion of rules.
Well, you've heard about our $1 million bathroom in San Francisco, right?
Yeah, exactly. $1 million toilet. Ezra Klein did a great thing on that. But we have rules that say things like the elevator has to be big enough for a stretcher. We're talking about a 3-story building. So elevators in the U.S. cost 5 times what elevators cost in Western Europe. It's not a problem with elevators in Western Europe. They've just been over-designed. So you have an accretion of things like this, that the result of which is we end up getting half the number of units of affordable housing that we could for the same dollar. Probably less than, but probably a third, but half. So it's not serving the public good. So you need to go back and actually allow trade-offs in codes and such. And so I'm starting to write something now about, in the time being, creating a department of exceptions, where you would have an
Well, it's like a court of equity, right? So in the old days, you'd have a court of equity, right?
Right. You have an department of exceptions. You say, look, I can build this housing that's designed for short-term stay by homeless people that will have the following characteristics, blah, 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 blah. It satisfies no code. And if you have the authority to waive it, I will make, and you could do this, 10 times the number of units available for this thing by allowing me to do this. And if we had a department of exceptions that allowed that, you would dramatically reduce the number of homeless people in the streets in cities like San Francisco.
Yeah, but we'd still need some kind of oversight. I mean, I'm at the University of California, where we have all sorts of crazy rules and procurement rules and hiring rules and so forth. And so, it's very, very difficult to get anything done. And so oftentimes we'll, farm it out, or we'll create a unaffiliated entity that is not bound by all of these rules and regulations. And then what happens is those entities get filled with toxicity and arbitrariness and discrimination and pathological behavior and tyrannical leadership and so it's almost like the more time you spend in the bureaucracy, the less capable you are of common sense oversight.
There's a wonderful what's the name of the great Japanese filmmaker?
Kurosawa?
Kurosawa. There's a great Kurosawa movie called Ikiru about the bureaucratic mind. It was in 1952. It is brilliant, truly brilliant. I mean, it's really worth. You can get it on Amazon. It's really good. So here's my answer to what you're saying. First of all, periodically, every organization needs a spring cleaning. Nothing The genius of the Constitution is that it's only 7,500 words. So it's a really open framework within which people can do many things. It allocates authority. It doesn't tell people how to govern. What we have in federal government is 150 million words of binding federal law and regulation. Literally, 150 million.
So something like sunset provisions?
Yeah, sunset. The problem with sunset provisions is that legislatures have a practice of just waiving them. Mm-hmm. So everything sunsets after 10 years, and it comes up, oh, well, shit, it's all sunsetting. Let's waive it. So they waive it, right? So they never work. So what's really needed are kind of recodification commissions, area by area. I think you start with a Department of Exceptions, where you just start ignoring the rules for a while. And by the way, it's very easy to have oversight. You can have as much oversight as you want. The Department of Exceptions can report to some politically accountable person, to another, it doesn't matter, to a judge. The most important thing is the accountability has to be judgment-based, not legal proof-based. Because as soon as you get into the tangle of, quote, legal proof and compliance, then it becomes it becomes gridlock. So you can have oversight for, I don't trust anybody, so I'm all for oversight. But I learned, with my brothers, right, on the seesaw, so I don't trust anyone. But so I'm all for oversight. But you've got to give officials at least the initial ability to make these judgments to build whatever it is, SRO housing or whatever's needed. And at the moment, that will require a Department of Exceptions.
Now, I think one of the points that you made, which I thought was really interesting, is that the more complex the rules that you design in order to get around arbitrariness, the more arbitrariness you allow back in, right? So arbitrariness seems to exist at either end of the spectrum. One where you have too little rules, and one where you have too many rules.
Completely. So every practicing lawyer knows this. You can take, no matter how well the contract is drafted, you can take any phrase and interpret it for your clients, in your client's direction. You can just, whatever it happens to be. And so ultimately, what you want is a system, not that people don't try to game for their own purpose, because everybody will always try to game everything for their own purpose, but where the argument is over right and wrong. When you have highly detailed law, the argument is over the parsing of rules. What is it? So in the case of the contract I was telling about, where my client wanted me to interpret it in a way, it says something like, any vested right shall be retained by these people. And he said, well, any vested right doesn't say that they're vested. It says any vested right. Well, that's true. You can interpret that to say that, well, they were never vested. But that wasn't what we negotiated. It was just what the words were used. What was negotiated is they're going to keep their rights. And so ultimately you want an argument over right and wrong. What makes sense here for the city of Chicago in building this toilet or building these, assisted living facilities or whatever. What do we need? What's the right thing to do? You want the argument to be over that. You don't want the argument to be over the rule requires, in cases of more than 4 stories and these procedures, that you must have an elevator that does this, and you've got to get approvals from it. That's the way modern law works. And you end up getting lost in this. You end up with these rooms with 20 lawyers in them, literally building an affordable care building with 70 units. You'll have 4 or 5 sets of lawyers in the room, all representing different sources of public finance or nonprofit finance or something. It's like all complying with some provision of a detailed provision of a statute that says this project must meet the following guideline. It's like a migraine headache. And so we end up with units that cost $750,000.
Yeah, I think someone who studied Russian law said that Russian law is designed so that everything you do is illegal. You do the A, it's illegal. You do the opposite of A, it's illegal, which basically meant that the prosecutors had complete discretion over who to prosecute and who they wanted to lock up, right? So,
Right.
If you have
Havel
too much...
talked about this.
Yeah.
Václav Havel, the former Czech, he was a brilliant observer of this kind of mindset of too much detail. He said, we're trying to make the world into kind of a crossword puzzle where everything fits neatly, and then someplace else he says, we keep trying to please everyone with the result that we're going to have these explosions, these irrational explosions as people can't take it anymore, and that's kind of, I think, what we're getting with the Trump. People, we've created this kind of suffocation of stuff. What's your preferred pronoun? You can't ever say anything that offends somebody. Wait a minute, it's a free country. I want to be offensive. You think I'm offensive? Fire me. Don't associate with me. But don't tell me I can't use a pronoun I want to use. I'll use whatever pronoun I want to use. It's a free country. And, that kind of suffocation is resulting in a bad thing in our culture. It's resulting in divisions where no divisions should exist. We ought to be really talking seriously about income inequality and the lack of opportunity for people on the, at the bottom of the economic and social scale. We ought to be talking seriously about the chances that young black infants have if they don't have exposure to words by the time they get to school and they're 4 or 5 or 6 years old or whatever. These are really serious problems for anything that purports to be a good society. Instead, we're talking about all this other stuff, that drives people nuts.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I think going back to Hayek, right? Hayek talked about, the rule of law versus the rule of men. And I think some people would say, well, hold on a second. If we're going to give more discretion to managers, to regulators, to judges, right, to officials, doesn't this sort of veer into the danger that you are creating a rule of men instead of rule of law?
Yeah, no. The answer to that is manifestly no. Law does not exist without legal judgment and legal responsibility. And the people exercising that legal judgment and responsibility should not be allowed to have, quote, discretion. They don't have discretion. They have the responsibility to make a decision, and someone else has the responsibility to make sure they don't abuse that decision. So in my world, no one has, quote, discretion. When they're acting in some sort of official way, or a free person has discretion to be a jerk, and then we're free to disassociate with the person. But in most areas of society, I'm not for giving people discretion. I'm for letting them take responsibility and giving somebody else the responsibility to oversee them. That's what the Constitution does. It gives people authority. It gives the executive the authority to make executive choices. It gives Congress the authority to make laws. It gives courts the authority to oversee all that. And all these things supposedly check each other. And there are various problems we could talk about in another podcast about why those things aren't working well. But in The Rule of Nobody, a book I wrote, 10 years ago or something, I talk about the role of human judgment in law and why there's always been a debate about it, and I go through the history of it from the Federalist Papers and the debates over that and onward. It's a very academic book, but basically makes the point that law can't work. Holmes talked about this. Cardozo, all the great justices in our history talk about this. Law doesn't work without the judgment of the people in charge applying the norms of law. Law is not a speed limit sign that says 55 miles an hour. It's principles like the reasonable person standard or, or whatever. It's an unreasonable search and seizure, free speech. All these things are principles that have to be interpreted by somebody. They're not self-executing. And the legal philosopher Jeremy Waldron put it this way. They said there's no Geiger counter that tells you what's the right amount of judgment, what's the right amount of, what's a good discretion, what's a good judgment, what's a bad judgment, and all that kind of stuff. Someone has to make the judgment. And Cardozo said, you may argue there's no assurance that I'll make this decision any better than any other man, and I accept the truth of that. But the bottom line is the need to make a decision on behalf of society is required, and I have that job. So I'm making a decision because I'm sitting there on the fences, drawing the boundaries of law. And so they have to do that. And those judges are in turn subject to either higher judges or to legislatures and such. So, I think it's really important to have this discussion about about rehumanizing all these systems. Law, rehumanizing, under the schools. Schools are incredibly human. They're just human institutions. It's a bunch of very different, 27 kids in a classroom, the personality of a teacher, all those things have to, you can't repress those things and make them work. You have to honor those things. You have to empower those things to make it work. So, I think it's really, I think we're really overdue for change. I mean, the people who talk about the political science of change talk about it as punctuated equilibrium. Periodically things go along for a certain way for a long time, and then everything falls off a cliff, right? It's like Ceausescu's, dictator in Romania for years after everybody hates him, and then finally somebody yells out, "Down with the dictator!" He's gone. Or now you have, for several years now, everybody's saying Joe Biden he's just fine. Don't talk about it. He's just doing great. Now all of a sudden everybody's saying, hey, wait a minute, no, you kidding me? So we're at the beginning of a point where we need to come to grips with a lot of the questions you're asking.
Well, I guess the last question is, has this process been inevitable? I mean, there are theorists of democracy who highlight how, sclerosis kicks in and, you start to accumulate all of these things which slow everything down. I mean, de Tocqueville, right, warned about this. Right. I mean, in a way, he may have even seen it coming, right? Peter Drucker wrote about this. I mean,
brilliant.
Is this
brilliant? Drucker. I can sit here and give quotes from Drucker. There's no theory of organization that works that doesn't give full scope to the responsibility of each person. You have to honor human agency in any organization, and both because the human mind, although fallible, is also brilliant in many ways, and because people need it. They need it for self-respect. Otherwise we get, the world of Aldous Huxley. We're all just.
But we see that. I mean, we see this with large corporations. As corporations get larger and larger, they accumulate all sorts of processes and procedures and things which ultimately make them vulnerable to disruption by startups. I mean, and it's very rare that an organization can kind of go back and become a day one organization. I mean, is that sort of the fate of democracies? I mean, do we have the capacity to
yes.
kind of purge these things without having to go through some kind of major disruption?
I think that the closest, so in American history, the punctuated equilibrium has happened generally in 30 to 40 year cycles, often in response to a crisis. The last one was the 1960s, in response to all the stuff I talked about. The one before that was the 1930s, where we got the idea of social safety nets because of the crisis of the Depression, right? We had Social Security and farm supports and all that. Before that was the progressive era, when we abandoned the philosophy of laissez-faire and actually sort of started, had government oversight over corporate practices. Before that was the Civil War, where the tectonic struggle over slavery finally came to a head, and we had to have a war over it. I think that where we are now is closest to the progressive era, where what we need to do is abandon a philosophy of kind of legal micromanagement, including a kind of a self-interested idea of individual rights, where any person has the right to complain about anything, and where we need to go to a system that honors the freedom of people who have responsibility to make judgments on behalf of organizations, including government itself. And so a kind of a dramatic simplification and rehumanization of the governing structures of society. That's what I think is needed, and it's overdue. And I think a lot of the fights you see between left and right would go away if people could wake up in the morning and solve the problems on the ground in front of them by doing what they think is right with their neighbors, instead of having it be an abstract fight in Washington.
Well, Phil, lots to think about. This book, Everyday Freedom, great place to start if you're interested in exposing yourself to Philip Howard's work. Check it out. But also don't forget all of the older books. Thanks for joining me, and look forward to the next book.
Yeah, well, it's great to be with you. I look forward to continuing our conversation.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.